Illinois Republicans say last week's election results should be a wake-up call for Democrats.
Well, the House Minority Leader spoke yesterday saying that it's time the two parties work together to solve the state's issues, saying the governor should not spend his time fighting the incoming Trump administration. Capitol Bureau Chief Max Scott from Illinois has more from Springfield.
This election cycle was a clear mandate against one-party control. The residents of the state voted with their pocketbooks in mind, signaling a resounding call for a better fiscal accountability and immediate relief.
Despite Donald Trump improving from a nearly 17 percentage point loss in Illinois in 2020 to around a 10-point defeat, not much else changed in Illinois electorally. Democrats won 14 of the 17 congressional districts, the same as 2 years ago. And in the state legislature, not a single seat in either chamber has flipped. This means Democrats will remain in the supermajority in both the state House and Senate. While McCombie admits she's not happy Republicans didn't pick up the 5 seats she predicted earlier this year, she says it proves Illinois has one of the most unfair legislative maps in America. And those results are not a mandate for continuous one-party control in Springfield.
Voters across Illinois sent a message last Tuesday. They've had enough, and they do not want more self-serving politicians pretending to care about Illinois families while pushing their progressive agenda.
Last week, Governor Pritzker made it clear he would not bend to the will of the new administration, saying Donald Trump would have to go through him to get to the people of Illinois. He's since started a group called Governors Safeguarding Democracy with Colorado Governor Jared Polis, a fellow Democrat.
I love this job, and there's an awful lot about it that I believe I can do to protect people from, the problems that seem to want to come from Washington, D.C. over the next 2 years.
In Springfield, Max Cotton, WGEM News.